Hello, my name is Kevin Howard, and I'm the host of Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. Now that 2025 is starting to wind down, we have come to the point where we need to direct our conversation towards what happened this year. What did we experience this year? What impacted the choices that we went through this year? What lessons can we take away from it? 2025 was the most erratic, unusual year, certainly in my life and maybe in yours. And so we're going to spend the next hour or so basically sharing our journey paths through this year of turbulence in order to try to figure out, okay, where do we go from here? So, 2025, I characterize it as the year we realized it's not working. So, coming into 2025, I own my own climate risk management and sustainability advisory services consulting firm. And this came after a 30-year career in banking, commercial banking in particular. And the culmination of my career in banking, I had transitioned from being a middle market business line banker to entering into enterprise risk, where I was looking at the safety and the soundness of the entire institution. I have had the pleasure of working for US Bank, the fifth largest bank in the country. And so as I had transitioned through my 30-year career, the last leg of it, the last 5 years of it, spent in enterprise risk, I started focusing in on climate risk management. And I was a part of the team, certainly at US Bank, but in our industry, financial services, to introduce climate risk as a vertical one risk for full consideration for risk management in the financial services industry. And in my role as the climate risk qualitative lead at US Bank, I led the effort to write and approve the climate risk management framework of the bank, and also to review and update the climate risk appetite statement for the bank. How much risk in this space could the bank take, and so on and so forth. So it was a strategic position that laid out the strategic approach for the bank on how they were going to manage climate risk moving forward. And so after I completed that work and successfully had led the process of getting the first climate risk management framework approved by the board of directors at US Bank, I graciously stepped off that stage after 30 years in banking and launched my own consulting business, Climate Changes Everything LLC. And I incorporated in the great state of Oregon. So coming into 2025, it had taken me a couple of years to build some traction. My target audience was top 100 commercial banks who also needed to understand what is climate risk and why do we care. And so since I had led the development of the strategic approach at the fifth largest bank in America, I felt that gave me unique qualifications to advise top 100 banks. And oh, by the way, the 100th largest bank in America still has about $100 billion in deposits. So we're not talking small banks. And do it at a considerably lower price tag than the major climate consulting firms like Oliver Wyman. It took a little while because they didn't know who Kevin Howard was. But once I started getting traction, the first bank I started working with was City National Bank. And I completed that assignment by the end of 2024. And so I had already turned my sights on other banks. I had my sights on the 16th largest bank in America. We won't need to name names, but they were interested in looking at climate risk and how I could help them get a deep understanding of how this was going to impact their safety and soundness and how they should mitigate this risk, right? So that's how I was entering 2025, excited by the prospects of continuing this process. Then what happens in 2025? The old saying goes that the best laid plans, when exposed to reality, right? Well, reality hit in 2025, right? Because Donald J. Trump on January 20th, 2025, was sworn in as president of the United States. And now I had analyzed Trump, and I'll be the first to admit, and you can go back to previous episodes of this podcast, I did vote for Donald Trump, right? Because I could not vote to maintain the policies of the Democratic Party as expressed by Kamala Harris. But if you want to know why, go back to, I believe it was episode 5, when I talked about why we need to have difficult conversations. And I explained how someone who actually voted for Walter Mondale in 1984 while serving in NATO for President Reagan, how did someone from that background wind up voting for Donald Trump in 2024? Well, I explained it. Okay. So beyond the judgment, because this podcast is not about judging each other, it's about understanding each other, right? The person I voted for took office on January 20th, 2025. And but I had an understanding. His rhetoric suggested that he was a climate denier. But once you dug into the rhetoric, primarily his issue was climate related impacts were not going to occur as significantly during the next 4 years. So therefore, it wasn't a priority for him. That was my read on him coming into him taking office. What I did not consider, and I did cover why we need a Trump whisperer now in a previous episode of Breadcrumbs. What I hadn't considered then, because I wasn't quite yet the Trump whisperer that I am today, was that one of the things that drives Donald Trump and his administration was to eviscerate his enemies. And tragically, President Joe Biden, made himself an enemy by breaking with American tradition and leading the charge to indict and prosecute a former president to the tune of 4 indictments against Donald Trump at an accumulation of up to 91 charges. And yet Donald Trump got elected anyway, which is another story that we talked about in a previous episode. But the fact is this really made President Joe Biden, an enemy of Donald Trump. And true to form, because he is a protege of Roy Cohn, the vitriolic attorney of McCarthyism fame, he looked to destroy anything that Joe Biden did. Unfortunately, the signature legislation, the most significant legislation that Joe Biden was able to pass during his 4 years was the Inflation Reduction Act. So one of the first things Donald Trump did was he ordered a freeze on the funding of the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, let me be clear. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2023. So it was a couple of years in to its process, right, by the time Donald Trump took office. And what the Inflation Reduction Act did as it relates to climate is it provided a minimum of an estimated $600 billion in federal matching funds to fund different types of sustainability, renewable energy projects, such as green hydrogen facilities around the United States. So it was a massive economic incentive program to encourage private sector investment by suggesting that the federal government would de-risk these type of investments by matching the private sector investment. So it was a huge piece of legislation. And by freezing that legislation, you had entities like Climate United who had won a $20 billion award to do certain renewable energy projects around the country. And again, this is a matching fund award, so therefore there was private sector investment along with that award from the Environmental Protection Agency, right? And so When the funds got frozen, the impact in the private sector, the impact for investments in sustainability, climate risk management, it everyone froze because the implications were all the capital investment that was attracted by the Inflation Reduction Act, right, now was at risk. And what the president was doing, which would prove to be not legal because the courts did reverse his ability to do it, was he was retroactively seizing, stopping the funding where commitments had been made under legal legislation that the private sector had every right to rely on. And he was changing the rules after the fact and then retroactively going back and saying, no, the money's not going to be available. Well, the courts interjected and stepped in and stopped him from doing that. But here's the thing, the signal that that sent to the marketplace was that he was going to chip away in every way that he can at the Inflation Reduction Act to destroy what it was intending to do, which was encourage private sector investment to enter in this realm. But he didn't stop there. He instructed his regulatory agencies, the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, had come out with the first ever final rule on climate-related disclosures to financial institutions. And this rule was essentially guidance on how institutions, particularly banks, how they were expected to manage this type of risk as it related to the safety and soundness of their institutions, right? Well, President Trump told the SEC not to defend that legislation, which private sector actors were litigating over in order to delay the requirements under the legislation to disclose different levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So there was litigation associated with it. And Donald Trump instructed his people at the SEC not to enforce the regulations and the rules that were developed and announced under the Biden administration. Again, further effort to eviscerate anything that Joe Biden did, to deny him any legacy effect. And so the implications of him sending out such a strong signal, anti-climate signal, was to encourage commercial banking, particularly the largest commercial banks, to abandon their net zero alliance international commitments. I mean, all these major banks, all the top four banks, the G-subs, had made commitments under the net zero alliance. It's global commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to zero by 2050 and to meet IPCC requirements to reduce them materially, i.e. 43% by 2030. So these institutions had made these commitments during the Biden administration. And as soon as President Trump got elected and sent the signal to the market that we weren't going to enforce the regulatory requirements, that we were freezing funds and that we were going to dilute the Inflation Reduction Act, right? That sent the signal to the financial services industry that they didn't have to take this issue seriously. And as a result, they deprioritized climate risk management. Now, it's not a universal thing, but in my world, as a person whose business model was intending to market to top 100 banks who were going to be required to follow suit of what the largest banks in America were already doing. The top four banks and the two largest investment banks had gone through climate scenario analysis exercise with the Federal Reserve during the Biden administration. And now you had this SEC rule. And the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, was coming out with their rules. All of them teed up to how to manage this risk, right? Well, when the signal was given that those rules were not going to be enforced and any rules that weren't made already were not going to be released and made, right? It just sent the signal to the industry that they didn't have to deal with this problem at this time. And so what that did to me is it basically gutted my business plan because it didn't matter that I was going to be a discount to the major consulting firms. Why spend tens of thousands of dollars developing a strategic approach to climate risk management that your regulators weren't going to require you to do. And so that's exactly what happened. So as I was approaching the summer of 2025, my client list was now zero. And I had to totally recalibrate my business plan for this new landscape. So now I want to take a pause here because I brought you through how I came into the year, my strategic approach based on my consulting business after my 30-year career in banking. And I showed you how some of the changes that Donald Trump had done impacted my business. And I want you, while I'm telling you this story of my journey path through 2025, to think about what happened in your industry. Think about what happened to you personally based on these external effects. Some of you, none of this stuff affected your life. Some of you, like me, it was catastrophic. It was profound, right? But but the idea is for all of us, we need to understand. This is what helps us to understand our neighbors. It helps us to understand the stress level that our neighbors are under, even if it's not us, right? And so consider your journey path. And actually, I'm inviting you to go into the comments for this episode and take me through the key components of your experience in 2025 where you had a plan and you had an approach for how you were trying to navigate your life and how these externalities outside of your community actually impacted your lives. Because as I will continue, many other choices were made that had much broader impact than just on the climate space. Okay, so back to my story. So, okay, so here as I'm entering the summer, I have to redo my business model and I have to redo it fast because all my revenue is gone. But this wasn't the only thing Donald Trump had done. Part of the reason why he got elected and for the people who elected him, and we covered this extensively in episode 1. Where are we in America today? When I said who elected Donald Trump, that was the first issue I talked about. Because who elected Donald Trump was the American working class and the American middle class. For the counties who voted for Donald Trump in 2024, they only represented 38% of the GDP of the country. And for the counties who voted for Kamala Harris, they represented 62%. All that's telling you, particularly when there was 2.5 million more people who voted for Donald Trump, is that they are in the mid to lower socio-economic class of the country, since they only represented 38% of the GDP. Okay, right. So that's who voted for Donald Trump. And it's important to understand why. And I explained that then too, is because the American middle class and American working class has been betrayed by globalization. They have been completely betrayed by globalization. The move in the 90s, finalized by Bill Clinton, right, to allow through international trade agreements like NAFTA, US-based multinational corporations to search the globe for the lowest cost markets in terms of labor, in terms of regulatory costs, right, so that they can produce their products at the minimum cost and then take those products and sell them back into the United States at the premium price. Okay, that was great for American corporations. As the history and the record shows over the last 25 to 30 years, that margins, profit margins for the American corporations have never been better, right? Okay, because they were producing their products in the lowest cost markets and selling them in the highest price markets, right? The problem with that game was that it commoditized American labor. Instead of also being committed to training up American labor who were losing all these manufacturing and textile jobs or whatever, production jobs, instead of training them up so that they can protect and continue to increase their income, basically they were left to their own devices, which ultimately had them slide into the service industry and make considerably less money than they did when they were working manufacturing and major textiles. So this is the abandonment that the American middle class and the American working class experienced over the last 32 years. So part of what elected Donald Trump was the desire to have government serve the majority of Americans again, and not just the professional class and wealth. And so one of the things he was doing, one of his strategies to do that, and he taught, the funny thing about Donald Trump is he actually talked about tariffs 30 years ago. Like Bernie Sanders, who talks about the same thing back in the 80s on C-SPAN when he was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont, or whatever, right? Yeah. Donald Trump actually talked about tariffs and his suspicion of international trade agreements in the 90s. But okay, that aside, his strategy was to reverse globalization. You haven't heard it, he hasn't put it that succinctly, but the whole idea of bringing the jobs that had been taken away, back to America. The way you do that is you affect the profit margin that those US based multinational corporations earn by producing the products in the low cost market and selling them in the high cost market. So, in order to bring them back to the States, that's an import. You can have a tariff, and that's how you usually regulate your imports. And so, Donald Trump has had I call it, by any historical basis, tariff madness. I mean, he has threatened tariffs of 100, 200, 150%, just insane tariffs against friends and adversaries and competitors alike, against European countries, against Canada, against Mexico. He's been all over the place with these tariffs. And what it has done is it's sent shockwaves into supply chain management. How do you, to what extent? Because no one was talking this way before President Trump, and talking it in a serious way, threatening our allies and our adversaries and our competitors alike. He's gone back and forth with everyone, virtually everyone, and it's upset everyone. So to what end is he doing it? Because it's certainly hurting America's relationships with our international trading partners. Okay. So he's serious enough about, he has to gain something out of doing that, right? So people do take him seriously that he would not be threatening these tariffs if his plan was not to actually impose them in some way, or if not impose them in some way, get something out of it, which the something out of it that would serve his customer, the American working class and the American middle class, is one of these big companies bringing the manufacturing back, and that's setting off a trend. So this is what he's trying to do. And so that activity has basically had negative impact on those massive multinational corporations who are not sure to what extent their margins that are from the international production brought back into the United States are at risk. And so they have started laying people off, tens of thousands. And if you look at the unemployment rate when Donald Trump raised his hand, it was 4%. And the unemployment rate now is 4.4%. And that's pretty significant for 1 year. And so that might be one way that you have been affected, right? Is that tens of thousands of people have lost their jobs this year because of the insecurity of what's happening in the U.S. economy. But he didn't stop there. He started with the Doge program with Elon Musk to act to just crush the federal government. Now, you might say, what was that all about? What was the complete animus to the federal government? I've covered this when I talked about Donald Trump in the Trump Whisperer discussion. It has to do, again, with who the government is serving, okay, and who Donald Trump's customer is. Donald Trump's customer, in terms of how he got reelected, is the American working class, the American middle class. And he takes his customer seriously in that regard. And that's his history. He'll screw a lot of other people, but his customer, he takes care. He takes seriously. He understands his customer extremely well. He talks to his customer extremely well. He builds loyalty because of that. And therefore, it matters to him, right? And so the customer in this case has not been served by the American government for the last 32 years at least. Right? If you look Pick any major agency of the federal government, Health and Human Services, Food and Drug Administration, and you ask yourself, what is the trend line of the American people that they serve? What kind of job are they doing? So if you're a fan of the Department of Education, I believe we need a Department of Education. But the whole point of the Department of Education is to engage in national policy that facilitates the highest quality public school education in the world. By the way, we used to have that back in the 80s. What's happened in the last 33 years, since 1992? It's been a catastrophic failure. The trend line in every metric for American education is horrible. So the whole sledgehammer, burn this whole mother down type approach to the federal government is because you had a bloated federal government. You had a bloated Homeland Security Administration. You had bloated agencies all over the place. And the people that they were supposed to serve were doing much worse over a protracted period of time, over 3 decades. Okay. So, yeah, it's time to raise and rebuild that. I'm not an advocate for anarchy and that we don't need a government or we don't need these agencies. But the people who were doing the jobs that they were doing and making real money doing those jobs, I'm sorry. If the people you're supposed to be serving are worse off and have been for decades, you need to lose your damn job. Yeah, I'm saying it right here, right now. And so that's what he was doing. But the turbulence that was causing by gutting so many of these agencies with radical change. Now, I want to point one thing out. For those of you out there who were fans of Bernie Sanders, understand he was talking about a political revolution. And if there was going to be teeth in what he was doing, it would have had this kind of impact. Radical change is always profound, and people don't know what to expect. And usually there's no historical data point to say, hey, this is what it'll look like when you rip everything apart. Well, that's what Bernie Sanders was talking about too. A political revolution. He wasn't talking about making little tweaks around the edges. What Trump has actually done is he has taken a sledgehammer to the government. So between the tariffs, between temporarily freezing the Inflation Reduction Act, between not enforcing federal regulations on climate, sustainability, with gutting tens of thousands of federal jobs, with orchestrating a shutdown in the federal government, the longest shutdown of the federal government in U.S. history, all these things are destabilizing factors in the current economy. And capital doesn't know how to play it. So it freezes. So this is one of those moments for you to look at, okay, you may not have perceived as you were going through the year that any of these factors were impacting you. But if you found yourself losing a job, if you found yourself, your customer base dwindling, if you found erratic changes in the environment in which you had to operate, if you found the stress level that you were dealing with, much higher, yeah, a lot of these factors, the fact that people don't understand what's going on, they don't understand where this is heading, they don't understand, what does this look like? How is this ultimately going to affect me? Even if I have a job, how long will I have a job? Okay, that kind of thing, right? This is the moment in this podcast for you to start cluing in to, oh, that makes sense. That's why it was this way. If you didn't know that already. Many of you, I suspect you did. Okay. So back to the summer of 2025. So now this is where we are. I have to come up with a new business plan. And I say, I'm not talking to the banks because the banks are not prioritizing this right now. Okay. So who's interested in climate? Because the fact is that, and I cover this and why climate risk is real, right? That episode is the greenhouse gas emissions that are accumulating in the atmosphere and that are warming the planet and therefore are changing the climate. That's creating extreme weather events. That's impacting the kind of species that can survive on the earth right now. that's actually accelerating extinction level events for many, many species. In fact, 70% of the species on the planet have gone extinct since 1970 because of this warming. Okay? These events are occurring, notwithstanding the politics. In fact, they don't care about the politics because it's chemistry that makes a carbon atom absorb sunlight or methane molecule absorb sunlight. It's chemistry. It doesn't care about politics. Okay. It's so I needed to find allies who recognize that this is not a political question. This is an ecological question, and it's going to be existential to humanity if we don't get our arms around it sooner rather than later. So who are they? And what I determined is it's mostly it's now down to the state level, local government, and the private sector who are focused in this area. So I turned my direction towards them. Then I said, well, okay, but how do I want to approach this? And why aren't most people's hair on fire? And I mean the average American, the people who voted for Donald Trump. Why isn't the middle class hair on fire? Why isn't the working class hair on fire? And it's because, well, a couple of things. One, they don't perceive that the climate related impacts are impacting their day to day lives. That's the general issue, right? And that, but worse, the harder the economics is, the more a person has to worry about whether they're going to eat or whether they're going to have shelter or whether they can take care of their families. The more that that's your concern, the less you can concern about other things, particularly things that are not occurring every day in your life. The impact is not obvious because every day we have to eat. Every day your children have to eat. Every day you need shelter. And so too many people, that's their space. Their energy is how can I keep both of my nostrils and my family's nostrils above the waterline? Because otherwise we're going to drown. So yeah, Mr. Climate Man, you telling me all that noise. Yeah, I appreciate it. I'll worry about that when I can breathe. Okay. And I get it. So my thought process is how can we bring climate, climate adaptation, climate mitigation, sustainability questions to meet people where they are? Okay. And I decided, all right, the biggest economic impact in the country that I could see was the housing affordability crisis. Now, what are you talking about, Kevin? Now, I have talked about this in previous episodes. If you missed it, you need to go on back there. Okay, the housing affordability crisis, and it's not just a thing to say; it's real. And if you don't know about it, well, how about this? If you're in the middle class or in the working class, the working poor, and stuff like that, yeah, it's drowning you now. I'm just saying, if you don't own a house and you're in the rental market, yeah, for many, many places in this country, it's damn near drowning you right now. And how did that happen? Well, we would just say it this way. If you look at the value of a house in January of 2021, and you compare the value of that house to, and I just keep it simple, January of 2025, 4 years. Yes, I just captured the Biden administration right before Trump took office. The median value of an American single family home went from 340,000 to 440,000 in that span, up 28%. A profound increase in the value of a house for that time frame. Typical appreciation is 6% a year. Okay. And at the same time, the 30-year fixed rate mortgage, because no one's playing the adjustable rate mortgage game after what Wall Street did to us in 2008 and 2009. Okay. So the 30-year fixed rate mortgage rate went from 2.9% in January of 2021 to like 6.4% in January of 2025. So when you take the combination of raising the value of the house 28% and nearly tripling the cost of money. Now you have pressed the affordability so deep into the middle class that the average middle class household can no longer afford to buy a house in the average American city for the first time in US history. And the impact of that, middle class people who normally would be able to afford to buy a house and would have been able to afford to buy a house coming out of COVID in 2021, their house buying income, historically house buying income, is driving up rents in the rental market. Why? Because this is free market capitalism. And if you own a rental property and you realize that there's a new category of renter who happens to make the kind of money that used to be able to afford to buy a house, but they no longer could afford to buy a house, that means you have a category of renter who could pay more rent than historically any renter has been able to pay. And here you go. And so now you have the working class who've been priced out of the housing market for 30 years. All of a sudden, they go from the historical affordability rate of paying rent at 30% of your take home pay to exceeding 50% of their take home pay. And what that translates to across our country is that now we're in the double digits, and as in beyond 10% of American households who have food insecurity. Why? Because people would rather have shelter than eat as much as they normally would eat. And that's exactly what they're doing. So this is the housing affordability crisis in America. And because everyone needs housing, this is trillions of dollars. This is a massive problem. Okay. So I realized, oh my God, okay, this is where many of the 340 million Americans, yeah, we got a good solid 150 million Americans in this space. What can we do in the climate space that also addresses that affordability issue? Well, so happens just when you can't afford to buy a house and therefore you're running up the rental market, yes, you middle class people, right? We are required to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions if, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is comprised of 195 nations. There's only 193 in the United Nations. The unanimous opinion of 195 nations, of the scientists, not-for-profit scientists of 195 nations, say to give us a 50% chance of avoiding the worst, irreversible, catastrophic climate-related impacts decades from now, we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 43% by 2030. It's 2025 by 2030. Okay. And the lowest hanging fruit in the U.S. economy on reducing greenhouse gas emissions is housing emissions. It's 15% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So right at the time that we cannot afford to, the middle class cannot afford to buy a house in the average American city, we also need to invest in converting the heating and AC and the source of electricity to energy efficient, renewable energy. Okay. So if we can devise a plan, a strategy that could make both the house sustainable, which we need to do by 2030, and affordable, which we need to do in order to relieve the inflationary pressure on the working class, who is now paying more than 50% of take home pay in rent. Okay. If we can solve that problem, we would be meeting people where they are, and we would put climate justice front and center. So that became my plan. My business plan is, how do I solve that problem? I'm a 30-year banker. I understand financial instruments. How do I solve that problem? Okay. But it's a big problem. So next thing I did was I said, okay, well, where's the money? I mean, because this is, look, when we're talking, this is a national problem, by the way, right? Think about that. So this is a massive problem. Who got the money? Well, as I've covered in how extreme wealth broke the US economy, they have already looted the federal treasury. We went from $4 trillion in federal debt in 1992 when Bill Clinton took office to over $38 trillion right now. Right. That extra $34 trillion that didn't go into American infrastructure, our grade is D minus. Ask Baltimore about the bridges. We don't have to go there. It didn't go into American education. It didn't go into access to American healthcare. It did not go to the American people. They did not go to the American middle class, the American working class. All those segments beyond the top 1% are doing worse off than they were in 1980. So where it went was to create the greatest billionaire class in history, the wealthiest billionaire class ever. So that's where the money went. It's not in the federal government. And with the federal government abdicating in this area of climate, a lot of the funding that the states rely on also are from the federal government, and that's getting shaky at best. So there's not a wealth of money at the state government level either. Most of American wealth is in private sector, highly concentrated in extreme wealth. Okay. So they got the money. Is any of them willing to give some back? Well, actually, yes, at the risk of it being greenwashing, there is something called the sustainable debt market. And the sustainable debt market is an investment market where extremely wealthy people, and I say that because they have to be wealthy enough to do this, they agree to take a less than market return on their investment in order to achieve a sustainable goal, a green bond or a green loan, or a social goal to bridge wealth and income inequality. So, if they're willing to take a lower than market return on investment to achieve one of these goals, then that's an indication that these people who have so much money are willing to participate, and that's where the money is. But what it tells me also is that the concern that they have is that the money goes to achieve the goal and not in the pockets of the goody two shoes who say they want to help poor people, people who are disadvantaged, but the money doesn't seem to find its way there. Yeah, let's take a second to acknowledge that fact. For the progressives out there, because, yeah, it's not the conservatives, so let's be candid. For the progressives out there who have made it a career to advocate on behalf of the disadvantaged, of the underprivileged, on the under-resourced, millions of people in the United States who have earned bank on behalf of those people, and those people are just doing worse off over the last 32 years. Well, I will say this much. This is an Al Pacino moment from Sense of a Woman. You know the scene I'm talking about? It's the scene where he says, Billy, Bobby, Jerry, F you too. Yeah, well, yeah, that's what I'm saying to all you progressives out there who have been in the industry to help these people. And they are a nostril and a half, if not both, underneath the waterline. And you're sitting there doing well, earning your six figures. Yeah, F you too. That's how bad it is. Well, then the flip side of that reality, which has been the case for decades, right, is that wealthy people say, well, yeah, we might want to help, but we're not helping by lining the pockets of these hypocrites who say they're helping people who are underserved, and they are the only ones who are benefiting. Yeah. This is why they go to the sustainable debt market, because the sustainable debt market, which is often worked by the capital desk of commercial banks, and these deals are put together, use sophisticated financial instruments that make sure that the money is going to achieve the goal, that the discount is tied to the money achieving the goal. So then my idea is using my 30-year banking career experience, maybe I can identify a market tested financial instrument because there's no proprietary rights to financial instruments like a mortgage, right? If I could find a market tested financial instrument that's legal in most states, if not all states, right, and reprice it for affordability, it would be a vehicle that extreme wealth can look at and say, yes, that does work and that does make sure that the money goes to what it's supposed to do, which is to achieve the sustainable goal or the inequality goal. Okay. That would be the bridge that they need to solve the housing affordability crisis in America. Okay. So I did. I found one. Now, this is, if you want to know how hedge funds make money, yeah, it's all types of nefarious ways. Well, they created a financial instrument. In my opinion, my read of it, my banker's read of it, is this financial instrument was designed for the person who got laid off working for Silicon Valley in California. Because they were making four, five, six, $700,000 a year. They're making great money. And they had a nice house, expensive real estate, probably had tons of equity in their house. And then they got laid off. And the problem would be that it would take them quite a while to replace that level of income. And that would probably cause a significant degradation in their credit. Temporary once they recovered in terms of their income and pay things off or whatever, but certainly in the near term. And so here you had a target customer who was cash poor because their income had dropped from whatever they were making in Silicon Valley to whatever they're making, in the garage, right? And so they're cash poor, but they're asset rich. And so to get a home equity loan, a HELOC, a standard HELOC, because it's a second position loan and HELOC lenders really lost their shirt in the financial crash of 2008, 2009, right? Okay, you have to have decent credit. You have to have, 650, maybe 640 minimum, right? But these people who were the target customer, their credit is more like 550, right? Because they defaulted on all these massive credit cards and stuff like that because their income cut in half and things something had to go and they were maintaining their mortgage because that's the asset that they had to maintain and so on and so forth. Okay. And so the hedge funds designed something called the home equity agreement. And so, so what this was is, and I'm going to use a simple example. So here you are, you're that Silicon Valley person who got laid off. 6 months down the road, credit score has plummeted to 550, right? I'm just going to use simple numbers. You got $1 million house with a $500,000 mortgage. And you're getting desperate to the point where you're going to start missing mortgage payments because you defaulted on most of the other credit, but you're holding on with the mortgage payment. So you're desperate enough now, and you can't get a home equity loan, so that because your credit score is too low. So and you don't have the kind of income level that you need to have. They have this instrument, and it's a second position loan, and they're willing to go up to 80% loan to value. So in our example, they're willing to give you $300,000 because that the $500,000 mortgage first, $300,000 puts you at $800,000, and that's 80% of the value of the house. Okay, so they're willing to give you $300,000 now, which is 30% of the equity and 30% of the total equity in the house. Oh, well, excuse me, 30% of the value of the house. Okay, and you don't have to pay anything on that until you refinance your house in the future. But and that's when you have to pay. And what you have to pay is an increased percentage of your future equity. So I gave you 30% of the value of your house now. But let's say you've replaced your job and everything, and now you want to refinance your house 5 years later. Okay. And this is an example of the home equity agreement. In 5 years, you have to pay 35% of the future value in 5 years. So, given the appreciation of California real estate, that $1 million home is way over 1.5, maybe approaching, 2 at that point. And you got to pay 35% of that future value. Okay. So, penciling it out, I give you $300,000 today, and in 5 years, you give me $525,000. Yeah. You've just taken a payday loan on your house, on your biggest asset. Yeah. That's how awful. That's the usury level of the home equity agreement. Okay. So you take that instrument, and the hedge funds did about $1 billion worth of that business. Could you imagine? And because it was good for business, they got it legal in 32 states. So it's legal. It's been through the courts. It's been adjudicated. It's valid. It's a working financial instrument. So you take that same instrument and you just reprice it for affordability. And so that was my idea. And I came up with something I call it the price gap agreement. Okay. So now what that is remember I gave you median house prices. So in more expensive markets, you just adjust it up. And in less expensive markets, you just adjust it down. But we're going to use the median average across the country. The gap between the home that you could have purchased, the value of the home in January 2021, and the value of that home in January of 2025 is $100,000. So what we're going to do is the price gap agreement covers that gap. And it's going to add a little more. And here's the little more. The little more is probably about $30,000 to make sure to upgrade the utilities in the house. And we'll use bulk purchase pricing for the heat pumps, energy efficient heat pumps, and to install solar panels where appropriate on for the unit of the house. We will also explore community solar where that makes more sense in denser populated communities. But ideally, single family home, solar panels on top to make it fully renewable energy, heat pumps, energy efficient utilities, HVAC, AC, and heat for the house. So basically, you will have state minimum utility bills in that house. Okay, so here you have a $400,000 house that you can no longer afford at 6.4% to put your 3% down for an FHA loan, right? You're $12,000 down, and then you get a mortgage for $388,000. You can't afford that at 6.4% when you could have afforded it at 2.9% that it was in January of 2021. Okay, what we're going to do is if you fully credit qualify for a $300,000 mortgage, the only reason why you can't qualify for the $388,000 is you don't make enough money at 6.4%. But you do make enough money for $300,000. Okay, great. So you take your fully qualified mortgage. We provide the gap financing in the second position, just like the home equity agreement. But this investor, sustainable debt market, the investor who's trying to achieve a social goal or sustainable goal. And in this case, it's going to be both because this is going to help someone afford to buy a home and that home is going to be fully green certified, sustainable. Okay. So it achieves both the goals. Okay. That investor, instead of getting an increase in your future equity of your house, which is usury, in my opinion. Yeah, I know the hedge funds would be like, no, it's not usury. Forget about that. I think it's usury. And it's my podcast. So for that person, they come with their $12,000 down to buy a $400,000 house, fully credit approved for a $300,000 mortgage. We provide the gap of the $100,000 plus the upgrade with the heat pumps and the HVAC and the solar panels, about $30,000. Okay. They're going to be sub 80% loan to value on that house which means no mortgage insurance. That's about $100 a month, right? And they're going to be at state minimum utilities. Why? Because they have solar panels on their roof. They're generating their own energy and they're energy efficient as it is. How good does that get? Right. Okay. And what the investor is going to get when they choose to refinance, and they have to refinance no later than 10 years, is the IRS break even rate, which starts at 4% and peaks at 4.9% after 9 years. Okay. So this is a lower than market return on investment, between 4 and 4.9%, depending on how long the person takes to refinance the house. But the good news is that in most markets in the United States, that IRS break-even rate is less than the standard annual appreciation of the home. The home value will increase usually between 6 and 7%, depending on the market, but certainly 6%. So the benefit of that type of pricing is that the home buyer not only gets a home that they could afford that they otherwise would not have been able to afford, but they're earning equity both on their first as they pay that $300,000 mortgage and on the second, because the price gap agreement facility is earning an interest rate lower than their annual appreciation. So they're earning equity there too. So they get the benefit of wealth building, which is the primary methodology of the middle class and the working class to earn wealth, is through their home. So it achieves all of that. And it's going to be real estate secured. Okay. So that's my idea. And I have taken it to a wonderful company called Second Muse. Second Muse is an innovative capital accumulator where their goal, their mission, is to obtain capital through a wide range of sources, everything from charitable organizations to impact investors to commercial banks, any sources of capital. They use very sophisticated methods and creative methods of stacking capital for the benefit of underserved communities in the climate tech space, in the climate risk management, adaptation, mitigation space, in the sustainability, regenerative market space. They're doing amazing work. So, working with their Future Economies Lab, we are partnering on developing the price gap agreement. And what we're doing is creating a proof of concept phase. And that proof of concept phase is because in order to scale it to the sustainable debt market, you got to make sure this thing works. Now, rationally, I think it works because the home buyers are going to be credit qualified. And the only reason why they need the assistance is they don't make enough money to buy the house at the current price point. They've been priced out, but they are credit approved in a conforming mortgage, not a subprime, high risk mortgage. Okay. So their default rates will be normal quality credit default rates, which is low, which is the kind of thing investors look for. Okay. Okay. So it should work, but we have to have a proof of concept phase. So our goal is to perfect the financial instrument, the price gap agreement. Again, we're modeling it off the home equity agreement. It's already legal in 32 states. It's already principally perfected, but we're going to reprice it and perfect it so that we work it out with title companies and make sure that it flows it accurately as we intended. Okay. And to put an offering document together in order to raise up to $250 million from charitable organizations and impact investors to do up to 2,500 homes, 2,500 price gap agreements in the Pacific Northwest. Okay. That would be the proof of concept phase. And so after like a 3 to 5 year period, because it will be no problem selling 2,500 homes to a middle class who can't afford to buy those homes under these terms, right? If we can raise that money, right, we will have the model and show that this does work and that it matches historical default rates. And again, it's real estate secured. So all those traditional mitigations would be in place. So it will work. Okay. But once we demonstrate in the proof of concept phase that it works, then you can actually look at the state level. It scales to the state level. So if you take the state of Oregon and you look at how many annual home buyers have been priced out of the market and would be eligible in the state of Oregon, my initial analysis is that that's about 35,000 home buyers a year for the state of Oregon, right? Well, at $100,000 to $130,000, that would be a $4 billion dual green red, dual sustainable social bond out of the sustainable debt market, which is an absolutely manageable facility for the sustainable debt market that funded 1.74 trillion in 2024. They can handle $4 billion. That would cover the state of Oregon. The state of Washington would be between 7 and 9 billion. California is a whole different monster. But you know what I'm saying? So it scales through the sustainable debt market at the state level. And once we do enough states at the state level, the federal government can step in. And this is how they could do it. They can mirror the SBA 504 loan program. The SBA, Small Business Administration 504 loan program, allows small businesses who are successful in operating, they're not startups, to buy their commercial real estate in a context where they do not have the credit strength. And I don't mean paying their bills, I mean capital strength, balance sheet strength to get a conventional financing for the private sector market to finance them. So they're not capable of getting the financing in the private sector to buy their own real estate that they occupy, these small businesses. The SBA 504 program provides them low interest financing. And how it's done is the federal government gives a guarantee. And then private sector investors on Wall Street take the federal guarantee and they add a couple of basis points and they fund these loans that allow small businesses to buy their commercial real estate. We've been doing it since the 80s. And oh, by the way, default rates very low. Investors haven't lost any money. They will do this all day long. So we can scale the price gap agreement using federal guarantees as one methodology, mirroring the 504 loan program, but for residential housing to make sure this national calamity gets solved. And this is how we will bring climate risk management, climate risk mitigation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions to where Americans are. Because if we could solve the housing affordability crisis and relieve the pressure on the working class so that we can relieve this food insecurity of the working class, everyone will be on board to climate at that point because it's through this methodology we're doing it. Okay. So that's my plan. Talk about bold and big. Yes. Okay. And this is where I need your help, by the way. I'm doing through something called the Visionary Fund. Yeah. Tamara Kaysen, incredible woman, started the Visionary Fund. It's a crowdfunding service for visionary ideas like this. We're trying to raise, through a crowdfunding donation situation, $300,000 because that is going to be the cost, overall cost, to perfect the financial instrument, the price gap agreement, develop the offering documents through Second Muse Capital, right, to raise up to $250 million from private sector investors for the proof of concept phase. But in order to do that, we need $300,000 to do that. And so we have, and I'm going to put the link to this, to the capital campaign on the Visionary Fund website. If you want to help solve the housing affordability crisis in a way to make affordable, sustainable housing, single family housing available in the United States, go to the link, check it out, donate what you can, because this is real and it can get done. Okay. So this is what my plan was by the end of the summer. And I've been working vigorously to try to get that done. I've also gone on we have an exciting new mayor in Seattle, Katie Wilson. Check her out. Okay. And she has been a legendary warrior for working people, in Seattle, one of the most expensive markets in this country. I mean, she actually unionized riders on the mass transit system in Seattle and got benefits and privileges through unionizing the ridership. I think it just unbelievable visionary, right? And so she was just elected mayor of Seattle. And we are working with her climate point of contact on her transition team to develop a first in nation proof of concept of the price gap agreement for the city of Seattle. So believe me, I'm working this angle whichever way it can because we're trying to help people, right? And yes, will I benefit in some way? Sure, but not in a usury way because we're all trying to help people. So this is what I started doing through the summer, entering into the fall, government shutdown. Everything started falling apart. We had the government close, the longest shutdown of the federal government in U.S. history, longer than what Clinton and Speaker Gingrich went through in the 90s. Further dismantling of the federal government. Okay. We have what's happening on the geopolitical stage. We are fighting and bickering with NATO partners. We are fighting and bickering over tariffs with European countries, with Canada. They're pissed off about the idea of being the 51st state. They talk about joining the European Union. That's what we're doing to our friends. All this bickering is going on, right? Thousands of people continue to get laid off. What it feels like is that everything is going sideways all at once. And that's when it dawned to me. This thing ain't working. We're at the point where it's just not working. And everything that we're trying to do is only making it worse right now. Maybe it's going to come, maybe there's going to be a silver bullet coming out of the other end. But from where we sit right now, we couldn't see it. And this inspired me to launch Breadcrumbs October 1st. Breadcrumbs, a podcast for people who know it's not working. And that's when I realized it ain't working. And we better start doing something. I'm trying to solve the housing affordability crisis because the problem when things are not working is that people get desperate. And we really could, in America, we really could lose social order in this country if people get to a point, if too many people get to the point where they can't take care of themselves or their family. We go into some sort of economic recession because of all the turbulence in every avenue of our public life. Yeah, we could lose social order in America, riots and craziness. Okay. Well, we need some wins. And that's why I was inspired to do Breadcrumbs. Because the first step when nothing seems to be working is you got to talk. You got to have a conversation. You got to find an authentic way to come together, to pull together so that we can figure some way out of this predicament we happen to be in. Okay. So I started Breadcrumbs. And I started with episode 0, which was actually on September 24th, the week before I launched episode 1. And episode 0 of Breadcrumbs was an opportunity to say, you know what? If you look at our public discourse, we're just yelling past each other. We identify each other by the uniforms we wear, the labels. Democrat, Republican, moderate, liberal, progressive, MAGA, conservative, whatever, religious, non-religious, atheist, agnostic, American, foreigner, whatever. We got a ton of labels that help us shorthand saying, okay, my team, the other team, us, them. And once we have identified, we talk to us. But the problem with us is that we're all saying the same thing. And the problem with them is they're all saying something different. And there's no exchange between us. Because when us is talking to them, it's a yelling match. It's a you are a horrible person. You are irredeemable. You should be canceled level of conversation. And therefore, we're just shouting past each other and nothing is getting done. In fact, what we're doing is vacillating back and forth between our team being in charge and trying to fix some stuff, and then your team gets in charge and they unwind what my team did and they start rewinding what they want to do. And then we get back in charge and we unwind what you did. I mean, isn't that what Trump is doing to Biden? Right? I mean, isn't that what Biden did to Trump's immigration policy? Reverse his rules and open the floodgates? I mean, this is what's going on. Okay, I launched Breadcrumbs because we have to stop that. We have to find a basis by which we stop shouting past each other and that we recognize that actually we are not only these things that we disagree about, that actually, if we expand the scope of our consideration, we would remember that there's a lot that we share, our shared experiences and our shared humanity. As humans, we have very common needs. I mean, who amongst us doesn't want safety and security for themselves and their family, doesn't want a future for their children and their children's children better than their own? Okay, these are a range of shared values that we all agree with that gets lost in the mix of the us and them, where the only thing we're focused on is the uniform you're wearing, and your uniform is red, and my uniform is blue, and therefore must be aliens. And we're not. We're both humans. Okay. So episode 0 was focused on saying, look, we're going to have a different type of public conversation. And that public conversation is, as opposed to focusing in on what makes us different or why we disagree, we're going to focus in on what makes us similar. What shared experiences have we gone through? And what shared values do we have? Because within that space, we can find a non confrontational, non threatening, and an authentic way to come together, to find a foundation by which we can come together so that we can ask the difficult questions that need to be asked. It is really important for the person who completely does not understand how someone could vote for Donald Trump. It's really important that you understand why people did. And that understanding does not come from calling them deplorable, calling me deplorable. It does not come from the only people who vote for Donald Trump are racist or misogynist or anti immigrant, anti gay, or Hitler lovers or whatever, you know. That's what we have been doing. And all it does is have us shouted past each other. Because then we turn around and call you other ridiculous things like libtards. And so, no, that doesn't work. We are neighbors. And there are thoughtful reasons. You'd be shocked to know that a person can have a thoughtful reason for why they would vote for Donald J. Trump. And that's what I talk about when I say in my episode on why it's important for us to have difficult conversations now. Okay. So in episode 0, we frame a new type of conversation for Breadcrumbs, our social discourse conversation, by our shared experience and our shared humanity. And then I gave you a bio on me. Who is this person who's the host of Breadcrumbs? And I said to you, I'm not coming to you as an authority. I'm coming to you as your neighbor because you'd be surprised that the talent that lives right next door, if you only noticed. So I'm your neighbor. I'm not a talking head expert on your news who doesn't live and pay bills like you do, right? And but has everything to say about how your life should be. No, I am you and you are me. And when I talk about the difficulties I'm facing financially because I had to rebuild my entire business plan this year and that I'm on the brink of running out of resource, right? You understand I'm coming from a position of authenticity. I'm not sitting in some ivory tower somewhere theorizing about the working class of this country or the middle class of this country. I'm living it just like you. And that needs to be a part of the conversation. We need to be included in that conversation. That is not the conversation you see on TV. Okay, so this is what we're doing at Breadcrumbs, and that's what I set up in episode 0. Go back and check it out if you want. Okay, and then there's only 2 categories of episodes that we've done because this is episode 13. So with episode 0, that's 14 episodes, right? We've done 2 categories of episodes. One that focuses in on our American experience. For you, those of you who are not from America, I'm not trying to be American centric. I'm speaking out of my lived experience, and I grew up in America. And that's why I'm speaking to Americans, right? I love the world, consider myself a citizen of the world, but I can't be presumptuous to say I know what it is to grow up in Canada or Mexico or Europe, for example. So I'm speaking out of authenticity. So part of one major theme of Breadcrumbs has to speak out of our experience as Americans that we've gone through together. So episode 1 talked about where we are in America today. I talked about who elected Donald Trump. I talked about the housing affordability crisis. I talked about the war in Ukraine and the ridiculousness of it. I talked about the genocide in Gaza because that's why Kamala lost the election, by the way. The deep analysis on what was the final differentiation was she lost too many Democrats on the issue of the genocide in Gaza. Yeah, just letting you know. But I talked about that. And then I talked about the climate crisis as an afterthought because I was going to have an entire episode on that one. Okay. So that was episode 1 because we'd all gone through all those things together. And so you got to look at your lens of experience those things, and I was giving you my lens so that we have a basis for understanding each other because that was a shared experience. In episode 3, I talked about how we arrived here. And I took you down the political track of 4 administrations: Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Barack Obama administration, and the Joe Biden administration. And I put Trump 1 aside. And we talked about that too. And I showed you how the neocons and the neoliberals, yes, Bill Clinton and Hillary, Barack Obama and Joe Biden, and ultimately Kamala, because she would not differentiate herself. They're the neoliberals. And the neoconservatives, George W. Bush, the Cheneys, Mitt Romney, the establishment Republicans, all of them, Rubio, all of them, they're the neocons. How they were actually 2 sides of the same coin. And how their agenda was American hegemony after the stand down of the Soviet Union, how America would be the only superpower and that we would enforce our domination of the world through covert and overt military force, through either financing counterinsurgencies and destabilizing governments who wouldn't cooperate with America's interests, or using our military directly at war somewhere over the last 30 years. So that's American hegemony. And then globalization, the liberalization of international trade, free trade, cross borders, allowing U.S. multinational corporations to produce goods in the lowest cost markets and sell them in the highest cost markets for the maximum profit at the expense of the middle class, at the expense of the working class. Okay. Those were the agendas of the neoliberals and the neoconservatives. And they both advocated for them. And that's what I talked about. That's how we got here. That's how we got into a situation where 77.3 million middle class and working class people voted for Donald J. Trump. Yeah. Okay. Then I went to the economic track, episode 5, how extreme wealth broke the U.S. economy. And it goes back to 8 days in August of 1971. I won't repeat, but basically it started when we moved from the gold standard. And that meant that we could print dollars. And then Lewis Powell laid out an argument for how shared prosperity was too expensive, because what Americans did with shared prosperity when the working class could afford to buy a house is we had the civil rights movement, we had the equal rights movement, we had the anti-war movement, we had the poor workers movement. We had all these movements, and power lost control. We had a working class media who brought down a sitting president. And Lewis Powell says we can't have that. And the only way we're going to get control of the country again is for corporations to spend more money than they've ever spent before, bending the will of the media, the government, and the university system to the interests of corporate America. And then Nixon appointed him to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he became the leading corporatist judge in U.S. history. And oh, by the way, this is how corporations became people. This is how corporations became superheroes, because they can donate endless amounts of money to campaigns, and you and I are restricted to about $6,000 each. So that's how they own our government. That's how they bought our government. Yeah. Okay. And I walked through that process. And the reason why they did it was shared prosperity was too expensive. They couldn't control us. So they had to make sure that we were what we are now. Desperate. Desperate. 1.5 nostrils underneath the waterline. How can you hold power to account where you're just trying to keep your lights on? Yeah, that's what they tried to do with us. That's what they did to us on purpose. And I showed the studies that showed that they were so successful that they transferred $50 trillion from 1976 to 2020. $50 trillion from the bottom 90% of the country to the top 1%. Yeah, that was episode 5, how extreme wealth broke the economy. Then I talked about why we need to have difficult conversations now, and I took you to my journey path of how I went from voting for Walter Mondale, who lost 49 states, to Ronald Reagan in 1984. Yeah, I admit that out loud. I know. I ain't got no shame, apparently. But I voted for Walter Mondale because I was a liberal Democrat. I was a progressive Democrat. I was a first generation American, and the Democratic Party had been there for me at that time. This was the 80s. That's when the Democrats actually stood for working people. So I voted for Walter Mondale. How does I go from there to vote for Donald Trump in 2024? And I explained that journey path because that's the journey path of so many of us. There is a line between the Reagan Democrats who abandoned the Democratic Party and voted for Ronald Reagan and caused Jimmy Carter the election. There's a line between those folks and the Tea Party, who George W. Bush had so betrayed that this was the insurrection out of the conservative side. It wasn't Obama. It was George W. Bush's complete abdication of fiscal conservatism that inspired the Tea Party out of his, to the Bernie Bros, whatever you want to call them, right, which is totally derisive, to not supporting Hillary and going ahead and supporting Trump. There's a line of these people who have been betrayed and bounced back and forth. And you need to understand how that happened. And the word was betrayal. I cannot express this more clearly. Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden absolutely betrayed the people who voted for him in the worst way. And most of the people who voted for him know it. And that is why they stand with Donald J. Trump. Okay, so I covered that. And then I talked about the history of why we fight, playing off a history where essentially we are living in President Eisenhower's nightmare. When he warned us in 1961 and when he was leaving office before President Kennedy took office, he warned us about the military-industrial complex and how it would destroy democracy and destroy our country if you let it. Yeah, it's doing it. Yeah. And so this was the track of episodes that was taking us through our American experience. And I topped it off with 2 things. Why we need a Trump whisperer. A Trump whisperer is someone who can see what Trump is actually doing. And the only way to see what he's actually doing is to ignore what he's actually saying. That's the secret sauce, right? Because once you see what he's doing, then you can then decide on that basis, what do I need to resist or what can I support, if any? Okay. And then we finished with last week's episode on where do we go from here? And we spoke about the foundations of a new economy that could serve all of us. So that was the track of our American experience, our shared experiences. And the other track that Breadcrumbs has dealt with is the track on our personal journey. Who is that person in the mirror? And all the ways we've been encouraged to forget who that person is. And it starts with, who am I? And I shared in my journey path this idea that I came to a point where I had achieved the middle class American dream. I had the house, I had money in the bank, I had the wife, I had the kids, I had the toys. It was all good. And one day I woke up and I felt empty. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate having the stuff. It was that, is this all life is? Accumulating this stuff, making money. I guess who dies with the most wins meant nothing to me. And that tipped me off to the idea that maybe I didn't know who this person was who's looking at me in the mirror. And that was true. I didn't. Everything that I thought that person was given to me by the virtues that define us as Americans and the narratives that reinforce those virtues. Those virtues are freedom, independence, self-interest, and competition. And these are things we never critique. We never question. They're just true. They're just givens. They're just things we accept. And yet those things were not my most important values. I built my entire life based on them, and it proved to be empty. Okay? I'd taken down the journey path, and I was asking you to look at the person in your mirror and look at the person you think you are and ask yourself whether it's true that this is who you are. Because I know this much. Behind those virtues was Kevin Howard. And it was only when I realized that that wasn't me that I could start the journey path of figuring out then who was I? Who am I? What do I value? And I saw that it was essential for me to figure that out in order to build a life that had meaning. Because it's through building a life that had meaning that you find your sense of purpose. And if you can live a life that's filled with a sense of purpose, then you're able to achieve the best thing that this life has to offer. And that's fulfillment. Okay. So I started us in that personal journey path, an invitation for you to do the same. Who am I? And then I moved into, I am not just a black man. Episode 4. So who am I was episode 2. Episode 4 was, I am not just a black man. Yeah, I know you're looking at me and saying, but you are a black man. Yeah, the emphasis is on the word just. I am not just the uniforms I wear. I am not just the place of my birth. I am not just the products I buy. I am not just the color of my skin. I am not just the faith of my choice. Who I am is a holistic totality of a person, which is much more complex than that, right? And that by identifying myself with these uniforms that I wear and identifying you with the uniforms you wear, I am no longer seeing my humanity or yours, which really does privilege me to treat you in ways that are not human. And it privileges you to treat me in ways that are not human. And so it was important to acknowledge that we're not the uniforms we wear. And that's what I did in episode 4 I am not just a black man. Then we had two other episodes that dealt with why finding truth is essential. Because as I said earlier, it is essential that you know what you value, the truth about who you are, the truth about what drives you, what makes life worthwhile for you. No matter what anyone else thinks, what do you think, right? What do you value? It is in finding what that is and building your life on that basis that things start to make sense. And that the way for us to analyze the significance of anything we are told is to start with what actually happened. That's the truth of it. What actually happened? What were the events that led to this thing that we're talking about now? That's the truth. Now, what that means has a lot to do with the players involved and what their roles were. But you cannot find the meaning of what actually happened unless you know what actually happened. And so it is essential to find the truth because it leads to meaning. And the meaning is what leads to how should that affect the choices I make? How should that affect how I respond to it? How should I affect what I'm going to do because of it in order to properly navigate my life, in order to make better choices in my life, in order to build a life that I find to be meaningful? Because it's only through that process that I find purpose, and it's only through living a life of purpose that ultimately I reach a point of fulfillment, that I could die today and I've run the race well, and I'm happy for it. Yeah, that's the best we can do in this life. Okay. And so I examined why truth is essential. And then finally, why we are encouraged to forget who we are. And I talked about the marketing and Edward Bernays and how he is the father of public relations. He's the one who converted marketing into a discussion of how, as a product and service provider, I can meet your actual needs. That used to be the marketing discussion. You have actual needs. I have a product that can meet your actual needs. How Edward Bernays converted marketing from that to me showing you that you want to purchase my product or service because the person you want to be buys my product or service. That beautiful girl over there, she's leaning on my car, the kind of car that you want to buy because you want that girl, right? You want to smoke these cigarettes because that kind of man smokes these cigarettes and he always gets the girl leaning on the car, right? Edward Bernays introduced that type of manipulation to sell us on the basis of identifying products and services with the things we value most, which have nothing to do with whether we need to buy them or not. And I used as an example a classic 1974 commercial from Chevrolet. These things go together in the entire USA. Baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet. Yeah, that's Edward Bernays. In 1928, he wrote the book on propaganda. And so this is what we have grown up into. Propagandized methodology of selling us stuff that's convincing us that the kind of people we would like to be, the kind of people we want to be, use these products and services. And so if we want to be that person, which has nothing to do with who we actually are, then we continue to buy these products and services. And that's what we've been fed from the youngest. So it was important to point that out, to recognize how we are propagandized and how from the commercials, it goes to the news. And so we're propagandized on whether or not Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, propagandized on whether or not the Russians' attack of Ukraine was an unprovoked attack, propagandized on why did Al-Qaeda attack us on 9/11? We propagandized on why did we attack Iraq after 9/11? Okay, we are propagandized on so many things. And the only way to unwind that propaganda is to recognize the manipulation that's going on, because then that's when we can unplug from it. We can see it for the lie that it is. Okay, the manipulation that it is, you know. And so that was the personal journey path. So we had the American experience journey path and the personal self-actualization journey path that we've done. Breadcrumbs. What a year. It's been amazing. So 2025. What a year. I hope you can take a deep look based on my sharing of my journey in this year and see how your journey path was affected by all these severe externalities. And I hope that you can find some strength in how I made choices. I hope you can find some inspiration in how you made choices and the fact that we have survived to this point. And now we've reached the breadcrumb for this episode 13 of Breadcrumbs. And that breadcrumb is 2025 was the year we did realize it's not working. So the question for us is, what are we going to do? It's not working means we need to fix it. Now, some people think that means we need to go back to when it was working. I submit to you, it was never working. And so much of what we've talked about in these episodes so far basically just showed that what has changed between when it was working for us in America and the fact that it's not working for most of us in America today is that the same level of exploitation that America was doing in the global South and in other places, all those shitholes that Trump talks about, yeah, the level of exploitation that was done that allowed Archie Bunker to own that house on All in the Family is now just being done to us here in this country. That capitalism is the last stage of exploitative, extractive economics. And for reasons that we discussed last week, and where do we go from here, it has run its course. So the idea in this breadcrumb is, now that we realize it's not working, what are we going to do to go from here, this recognition moment that it's not working, to where we need to go, to how we start coming together so that we can fix it, so we can create a society that works for all of us. We start that conversation next week. Now, I thank you for your time. This was another long one, but it was a year in review. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you will take the time to look at the links for the capital campaign, the crowdfunding campaign for the price gap agreement, because again, we're going to solve the housing affordability crisis and make sustainable, affordable housing, single family housing available in America. And we need your help for that. And I also invite you to please go to Patreon and consider, if you value the content of this podcast, becoming a subscribing member. Standard membership is $10 a month. Pay it forward membership is $20 a month. But that additional fee supports scholarship members because some people can't afford to pay the $10 a month. And so we offer both a half scholarship and a full scholarship for people who just don't have the resource. But they need this information. They need to participate in this conversation too. And if you love what I'm doing and you want to be a founding member, that's $50 a month. And again, the excess fees goes to supporting free members who want to fully participate in this conversation. So thank you so much. You take care. And I wish you and yours a joyful holiday season. Until the conversation continues. Be well.